Welcome to Here You Go. Here You Go is a project I started in order to present media that has been created or enhanced with AI. The project is primarily for my own entertainment and experimentation, but feel free to like and subscribe if you enjoy it too. And now for the presentation. Part 2.
This court order calls for the Chicago to be delivered immediately into the custody of the sheriff and auctioned for scrap. You and Miss Melvin will leave it immediately. Barnard nodded agreeably. All right, Commander. We'll leave right now. Lansford relaxed. He was about 2 feet below Barnard, the platform being that high from the ground. Barnard reached out carefully with his foot and shoved. The spaceman flew backwards into Grady, and the two of them crashed to the frozen ground. Barnard pulled the door swiftly. Lansford was clawing for his gun and shouting for Reemish to stop them. Reemish's gloved fingers fumbled as he drew, and the outer door was closed before he fired. Barnard grinned as the bullets bounced off the door. That hole was more than tough enough to handle all the bullets the space police could throw at it. Get off the ground, Gale, he shouted. He slammed the inner door of the lock and swayed with the control room globe as the rockets went into action. The ship jumped forward a few feet, balked for a moment. Gale threw a lever that opened the shutters. They saw the 3 policemen scrambling madly to both sides as the Chicago started roaring down the field. They blasted away and left the ground, the police still firing after them. Barnard clung to a bolted-down chair as they lurched wildly. Gale pointed the nose up until the ship would have been hanging from its props, if it had any. That's all we needed, said Barnard, sourly. We're both outlaws now, fair game for anybody. Our only hope is to break the dope ring. And Lansford, if we can. She looked distastefully at him. That would make a good story, wouldn't it? Daring reporter defies police, smashes neoin ring. Of course, there might be some opposition. Which way is Pluto? He asked, changing the subject. I haven't the faintest idea. Hand me that book, the big one, chapter 4. Barnard found that space navigation was more complex than he had thought. He watched in grudging admiration as the girl rejected course. Finally she looked up at him and frowned. We have to go somewhere the sun is almost directly between us and Pluto. We can get there fast, and speed is our best bet to evade the space police. But it'll be dangerous. I'll take the chance, said Barnard. But don't be reckless with your own life. How many months will it take? About 4 days. He stared suspiciously at her. It took me 14 days from Earth to Mars. What's this crate got that the inner planets line hasn't? She smiled. For a great reporter, you don't know much. They could make the Earth-Mars run in a day, but that's where the danger comes in. If a rock gets in their path, they have to be traveling slow enough for the detectors to find it and change the course. That's done automatically, but we haven't powerful enough detectors yet to handle high speeds. Oh, a job for the instrument makers? Barnard was beginning to realize his ignorance. You could put it that way. The chance of hitting anything big enough to hurt a spaceship is small, of course, but with hundreds of ships in space, there would be a lot of wrecks if they all went as fast as we're going to go. They plunged almost directly into the sun, nose forward to cut down the radiant energy. Gale sat in a sea of charts and tables, calling out instructions to Barnard, who was learning to handle the controls. She kept the rockets blazing, and before many hours had passed they could almost see the sun growing in size. In the growing warmth, the reporter dozed off to a restless, nightmarish sleep. He awoke with a start to find himself soggy with perspiration, his bones aching. Gale, hunched over her figures, looked up and grinned impishly. Warm? She asked. The cooling units are going full blast. The vision plates are all shuttered, but if you want to look, I've swung dark glass into place. She gestured to one of the darkened vision plates, and her fingers slid to a button that opened the shutters. Barnard looked and closed his eyes when he saw the monstrous body that was the sun. I've seen enough, he assured her. Where are we? Inside the orbit of Mercury. We'll be closer before we're farther away. Barnard studied her. At the most dangerous part of their journey, where space was filled with cosmic debris plunging into the sun, she had lost her hunted look and worked with a graceful nonchalance. She seemed actually to be enjoying the whole thing. The murderous forces of radiant energy pounded at and through the heavily insulated hulls. Barnard mopped his sweat-soaked face and waited for the metal of the spaceship to ignite. He stared at the girl and wondered how she could be so happy and poised, though she was as bedraggled as he was. Was her mind gone, too? He decided so when she told him, much later, "Congratulations, Mr. Barnard. Right now you and I are closer to the sun than any other human beings ever have been." He studied her face. She stared through the darkened glass into the inferno. "Except," she said thoughtfully, "for a few unfortunate expeditions that fell into it." Then they were starting to recede. The Chicago was inside the eccentric orbit of Vulcan, and starting to plunge away from the sun. The tremendous velocity they had been building up was far more powerful than the titanic pull of the sun's gravitational field. Gradually, the temperature went down to a cool 100 degrees, and the two humans, limp and worn, took turns catnapping. Barnard lugged can after can of fuel for the tanks. The motors pounded constantly, building up greater and greater velocity. At timed intervals, Gale took sights of the visible planets to check their speed. Their course curved far above the plane of the ecliptic. No passage through the asteroid belt at this speed. That was Gale's main worry. "We're veering out of the crowded belt, but there are stray asteroids far from the ecliptic plane. If we pass that region, we'll be in fairly empty space, and more or less safe, except for the space police." Barnard raised his eyebrows. "Space police? How could they trace us at this speed?" "We're as obvious as a green-spaced Venusian in New York," she told him. "It's the speed we're actually tearing up space. Lancefer's instruments could pick us out from 100 million miles. But that's a lot of room." She glanced slyly at him. "Now you can write science articles for the Sunday supplements." "Lay off me," he begged. His questing fingers found a cigarette as the clock ticked over to the hour. Smokes were rationed in space. He lit up and drew smoke into his hungry lungs, then passed the cigarette to Gale. "At least," he said, "I have a job to do on Pluto, which is more than you can say." "What are you going there for?" She passed the cigarette back. "It seemed like a good idea at the time," she said. Barnard stared silently at her. She looked strangely happy, plunging toward God knew what evils on far Pluto. He felt suddenly disgusted with the whole affair. They were two fools, defying the space police for the right to seek certain death. "Gale," he said, "don't go through with it. Slow the ship down and get off at the nearest human settlement, one of the Jovian moons, or Titan. I can handle this ship now. My syndicate will pay the entire universe." Exploded then. He pounded brutally into the concave walls, whirling end over end as the ship spun madly out of control. His head crashed as the spherical control room escaped its gyroscopes and he fought desperately against crushing blackness. Gale, was she mangled, killed? There was a senseless spinning, and then it was dark. He fought his way out of the blackness. Something was searing his throat. He coughed in agony and the shock brought him partly to his senses. Gale was pouring brandy into him. He saw her by the hard glare of the battery-run light. She was bruised and her coveralls were torn, but she was alive. He came to his feet and gripped her arms. "Gale?" Then he stopped. Her eyes were pained and misting. She swayed and collapsed in his arms. For a moment he was frantic. What to do? He carried her to her room, made her comfortable. Fervently, he hoped no bones were broken. But after a few minutes she opened her eyes and made a face at him. "I'm not hurt," she said dreamily. "Just a sissy. Go and see what happened." Gratefully, he watched her relax. He rubbed his hands thoughtfully and studied the damage in the control room. The meteor couldn't have hit very hard. They would have been killed without knowing it. A mere graze. He reached out fearfully and cut off the blazing rockets. The vision plates were black and no way of knowing which way they were going. That was his first job, then to unshutter the vision plates. He reviewed his knowledge of the mechanism. Evidently the master switch that controlled them all had been short-circuited. The switch was in the very tail of the ship. He crawled through the hold and into the tiny compartment in the tail. His pocket flash picked out the switch, and he made with the screwdriver. A few seconds later he looked proudly through the open plate, feeling like a master mechanic. But he didn't feel so happy when he saw a swifter moving point of light in the star-filled sky. A spaceship was closing in on the Chicago. And goose pimples rose on his arms when he recognized it as the police ship of Commander Lansford. He had to get back to the control room. The police ship was coming in at a half-mile a second, relative to them. What both ships were doing relative to the system he didn't know, or care. On his hands and knees in the close cubby, he scrambled around to get back to the control room. But already it was too late. Invisible beams of magnetic force leaped into life between the two vessels, as the lost ship clamped down with its revolves. Barnard was pitched heavily forward as the beams seized the Chicago. His head crashed into something hard, and he fell into a relaxed bundle. Chapter 5. It was cold, and he was beating his way out of a frozen death. He fought his way up from the floor, a sluggish chill in the marrow of his bones. Frigid, and he was sinking back. Remembrance shocked him into wakefulness. He stared from the port before his face. The police ship was there, clamped by invisible forces to the Chicago. Dully, he watched the 4 rockets blasting for deceleration. Deceleration? That brought him to frantic life. Were they nearing Pluto? How long had he been out? And why was it so cold? His teeth and knees still chattering, he wriggled down the narrow passage, pushed his light before him into the room where he had left Gale. He stared wildly. She was gone. Then the police had come aboard while he was unconscious and taken her aboard their vessel. Back in the control room, he stood helplessly for a few seconds, his mind starting to black out again. No power. The ship was leaking its heat into space. His numbed fingers found the right switches. Heat started to seep into the room, and life seemed to flow back into his body. But Gale, what of her? His distrust of the solemn-faced Lansford became suddenly more intense. He had to find out, and he was separated from the police ship by 50 feet that might as well have been miles. There was another way. He fumbled in the medicine kit, snatched the black bottle labeled a spine. He'd take a pill, even if it killed him in his weakened condition, and use ESP to find out what went on aboard the other vessel. He tore the stopper from the container and turned it upside down over his palm. Nothing came out. He cursed the empty bottle fervently, because already the only other answer was coming to his mind. He almost tried not to think of it. But this was emergency. In one of his pockets he found the tiny packages of neoin he had bought while cultivating the peddlers on Mars. There was a tiny pinch of gray powder in the paper he tore open. 1 gram a normal dose. Full strength, he was sure the stuff was seldom cut. He hesitated. Even 1 dose of the drug created a craving for more. He vowed grimly that this first taste would be his last. But this made his fight personal. He must destroy the source of neoin in sheer self-defense. Before the gray powder was past his tonsils, he knew he had taken too much for a beginner. A fantastic lift, a great self-confidence almost sent his mind out of the world. Grimly he fought to keep down the giddy exhilaration, and let his thoughts search for Lansford's ship. He had trouble coordinating his thoughts, because of the tendency of his drugged mind to stray. But he caught the control room of the police ship. Carefully, he kept away from the minds of the 4 people there. There was an added lift when he perceived Gale, small and defiant, facing Commander Lansford. It was Barnard's first experience in extrasensory perception. With all the power of his will, he focused his thoughts on the scene. Gale was speaking. "I tell you," she said, "the reporter is on Earth. He said something about having a big lead. I took the ship into Earth's atmosphere and he bailed out in a parachute. I was glad to be rid of him." Barnard hoped that what she said was entirely untrue. "You say Lansford's face was without expression, that he forced you to do this?" "I said no such thing," Gale told him. "And if you're going to twist my statements, I'll say nothing more. Lancefer's palm flicked out and Gale's head reeled. A vivid patch of red appeared on her cheek. Barnard's fingers tightened around the spongy arms of his chair. The commander turned swiftly to Reemish and Grady. None of the officers noticed, but Barnard did that. Gale's fingers were sliding along the control board. Barnard is aboard that ship, Lancefer snapped. You two couldn't have searched very thoroughly. This girl is lying. She couldn't possibly have slowed down enough to let Barnard shoot to Earth, and still have come this far. Reemish looked uncertain. Commander, you're the boss here, but what? Lancefer barked. Reemish's eyes darted briefly to where the red welt stood out on Gale's cheek. He licked his lips, and for a second his gaze met Grady's. For a moment he hesitated, then faced Lancefer again. He shrugged briefly. Never mind, he said. We'll talk it over at headquarters later. Lancefer lost some of his poise. He glared at the two patrolmen. You two get back to the Chicago. Find Barnard and bring him to me. Barnard saw Gale's hand hovering over the tiny bar. Suddenly he was shocked. He realized that the bar controlled the Duvals, the magnetic beams that pinned the two ships together. Then she had felt his presence and was waiting for a signal from him. He shouted the thought, "No!" Swiftly she disobeyed him, and twisted the bar. In almost the same instant she snatched the gun from Lancefer's holster. She backed away a step and leveled it at the officer. "Turn this ship around," she ordered. "We're going back to Mars." Lancefer's narrowed eyes peered at the control board where she had disconnected the grapples. He turned to the girl. His voice was flat, sullen. "Give me that gun." "No." She backed away another step and he followed, hand reaching. Her face became paler. Lancefer stopped and stared into her eyes. His eyes were compelling, hypnotic. She stood motionless and tried to shake the effect. Lancefer moved a step closer. Reemish's hand gently removed the gun from her fingers. Barnard swore disgustedly. Why had Gale cut the grapples? She must have some fool idea that he could beat the police to Pluto, win out on his own. Maybe he could. There were only two little difficulties involved. First, he didn't know where Pluto was, or how to find it. Second, the planet was Earth-size, and where on its millions of square miles of surface was whatever he wanted. The second problem was partly solved. From Lancefer's mind he had a vague picture of a vast white sea, trapped in a ring of white mountains that knifed into a black sky. From Lancefer's mind. Even in his neoin jag, a jolt came to him. How did Lancefer know that? Frantically, his thoughts speared back to the police ship. But it was too far now, only confused fragments came. But one image brought him to his feet, sobered and fearful for Gale's safety. Wildly he searched space for the magenta blasts of the police ship's rockets. Because his extrasensory perception brought one clear image. In Lancefer's pocket he had perceived the ancient 20th century coin he had given to George Melvin. Chapter 6. His fevered eyes studied the vision plate. Pluto, since they had been pointing toward it, must be ahead. He held his hand over a button, and crosshairs appeared on the plate. At the junction of the hairs was nothing. But he found a grayish blob larger than the others at the edge of the plate. Experimentally, he turned in the rockets and headed for it. It moved steadily to the right, so it must be the planet. Several hours later he was circling Pluto, searching grimly for the landmarks. A coating of frozen air covered everything Pluto's last snow. Luck was with him, for he had only half-circled the globe when he saw what he wanted. There was no mistaking the scene. His pulse leaped as he dived inexpertly down. Down past the snow-sheathed peaks, into a great snow-filled valley. He leveled off over the plain and brought his vessel to the surface in the thin solar illumination. He didn't know that landing on an airless planet was a feat for an expert pilot, neither did he realize that he was landing with blazing rocket jets on frozen air. But the luck of beginners was with him. He plowed a mile through the icy crust and jolted to a stop. In his wake vast masses of freshly vaporized air clouded the valley and started to freeze again. Barnard's eyebrows lifted when he looked out. A snowstorm, he marveled. He glared at the mountain wall 100 yards distant. There was a structure there, of human origin. A squat building from around which the snow had been cleared. George Melvin's spacesuit was too short for him, but he worked into it. Over the boots he fitted snowshoes. There was no sign of life from the shack, so he went out the lock and started trudging the 100 yards. Inside the spacesuit, his footsteps were distant crunchings, eerie misfits in this noiseless dead world. Still there was no indication of life from the building ahead. He noted that it was flush against the cliff wall. Was there a cave behind? A sudden craving for neoin filled him. He cursed and went forward more grimly. If this was the source of the drug, he must destroy it. The door was unlocked. He hesitated, then stepped inside cautiously. He glanced back once. The snow was still falling. His light revealed a small room. It was bare, except for a few tins of food and some motor parts. He frowned, wondering. Had he stumbled onto an innocent government post? There was a door leading back. Then his guess was right, this was a cave. He tried the door. It opened smoothly, and he followed his light in. There was a corridor. He paused for a moment, an instinctive fear bringing cold goose pimples. Something was here, something terribly alien, and terribly deadly. He waited, his heart pounding viciously. But nothing happened. Slowly he moved forward. On his right was a door. He reached to open it, but a strange reluctance made him leave it for the time being and continue on. The corridor ended in stairs, going down. He started down, his knees weak. Before he reached the bottom, he saw what was below. The floor of the great underground room was covered with a gray powder. Neoin. Chapter 7. Knee-deep in it, he stared at the tons of the deathly drug piled around him. This was it. The cache from which misery and nightmare death was dispensed to the human race. But what was its origin? One huge heap of the gray dust rose halfway to the 20-foot ceiling of the crypt. His eyes caught the tiny disturbance at the peak of the pile and followed a thin stream of the falling dust to the ceiling. The neoin came from above, then. And the door he had passed in the corridor above must lead to the place where the drug was formed. He plodded back up the stairs. Before the door he stopped, that chill fear again speeding his pulse. A racial fear of something not human, not of Earth, palsied him. He wanted a dose of neoin. His curse broke the spell and he flung the door open. He was inside, poking his flash into the distant corners of the huge cave. It must be 200 yards to the far wall. The roof was 50 feet above. On the sloping floor was a film of neoin dust. In a corner was a rocket motor, turning senselessly. It served no apparent purpose. But he backed away. Nothing here, he murmured. Still the feel of alien life persisted. Suddenly, in an unreasoning panic, he whirled for the door. And felt himself hurled back. Cold, slimy fingers seemed to be feeling inside his brain. He struck out at empty space, his involuntary scream pounding in his ears. The questing feeler went deeper into him and he staggered helplessly back until he rested against the cave wall. A chaotic jumble of thoughts whirled in his semi-consciousness. He felt that he was George Melvin, who had stowed aboard a ship belonging to a hard-faced police officer. Ron Barnard fought back with a defiant blast of his will, and for a moment the creeping thing stopped. He was suddenly sober, for he knew that this was where George Melvin had lost his mind. These creatures, whatever they were, possessed all of George's thoughts. And those thoughts included Lansford. Lansford was the man behind the neoin organization. The things were back. He stiffened his knees, made himself rigid against the wall. Sharp pain lanced through his temples as the weird struggle continued. Desperately he fought the hungry tentacles that wiggled into his thought centers. One after another, he forced back the alien thrusts. But each time, the creatures took something with them, some part of him. He was losing. Soon he would be another George Melvin, a drooling idiot. Already he was slipping. The feelers pushed themselves inexorably in. He noticed vaguely that his light was gone. Somehow he knew that they had drained the juice from his battery. In the dark he stood swaying, waiting for the end. Suddenly he was aware that it was light. He gazed dully toward its source, saw that a silver-helmeted figure was approaching. Lansford. The officer's hard face relaxed a little in a short chuckle. So you found my secret, Ron Barnard. And you're wishing you hadn't if you still have the wits to wish. His eyes behind the faceplate were mocking. My little friends were hungry. They aren't of the solar system, Barnard. They're true energy creatures, barely visible if you have good eyes. I was attacked by them while alone in a patrol ship. Fortunate for me that I found out in time that silver renders them inert. Barnard's slow-moving mind noted the silver covering over Lansford's helmet. He found himself on his knees, clutching unintelligently at the neoin dust on the floor. The struggle in his mind had died out, as if the creatures had retreated unwillingly before the silver. I brought them to this cave, Lansford went on. You see the rocket motor in the corner? They live on energy, and for the cost of a little fuel I get neoin by the ton. Neoin is the waste product of their life cycle. Matter from energy with living machines. The officer motioned toward the door. His stubby gun was in his hand. You'll come back here, Barnard. A human mind is a rare treat for my helpers. But get out now and let your girlfriend see what's happened to you. The two of you forced my hand. Now I'll have to get rid of Reemish and Grady. It's time for action. My days as a policeman are over. His eyes were hungry. I have gold here, Barnard. And platinum and radium. Neoin has made me rich. The next step is power. I have enough to buy Mars and Venus, and next I'll bring neoin to Earth. In a few years I'll be running the solar system. Wouldn't you like to print that? Dully, Barnard preceded him out. His brain was slow responding, as if he were drugged. Permanently drugged. But his will seemed left, as if the energy creatures had been eating away the pillars of his driving force when they could not beat it down directly. Silver in the door, said Lansford, closing it behind him. They can't escape. Keep moving. Back in the shack, Lansford motioned him to a corner and peered out. More snow was falling and 3 space-suited figures were coming through it. Lansford touched a switch and machinery began to throb. The room filled swiftly with air and warmth, and Lansford removed his helmet and struggled out of his space suit. Gun in hand, he stood facing the double doors. Barnard's gloved fingers were clenched. He gazed dully at his right palm, saw it filled with neoin he had unwittingly scooped up when he had clawed wildly in the cave of the energy creatures. He felt the craving coming back as he stared at it. Gale came through the lock, followed closely by Reemish and Grady. They stopped when they saw the gun in Lansford's hand. What happens, Chief? Demanded Reemish. His hand was near his own holster. And what is this place? First, drop your guns, Lansford instructed. Then take off your space gear. The 2 patrolmen unbuckled their belts. Gale stared at Barnard. Ron, they've done it to you. There was a sob in her voice. I should never have got you into this. Barnard's eyes focused stupidly on the girl. His thoughts came slowly. But the energy creatures had not finished their work. He was marshalling the mind power he had left, and a sullen anger was growing in him. With the slyness that often belongs to simple-minded people, his gaze went to the handful of neoin, then to Lansford, measuring the distance. 8-10 feet. He pretended to stagger, came a little closer. Illustration, Barnard's dull eyes swung to the steady weapon. Lansford chuckled contemptfully. Gale was at his side. He reached out as if to push her away, in the same motion his hand shot out, releasing the neoin squarely into Lansford's face. In that split second, Lansford's eyes widened in horror. His hand streaked to his face to keep the gray death from his lips and nostrils. Reemish was across the room, batting the gun from his hands. While Lansford still dashed the neoin away from him, Reemish and Grady had guns trained on him. Now, said Grady, grimly, what's this all about, Barnard? Barnard told them haltingly. He still had sense enough to realize that his IQ was down about 50%. His career as the top reporter of the system was done. All he had left was a grim determination. He picked up the silver helmet, fitted it over his head. Ron? Gale's eyes were shocked. What are you going to do? He turned silently, and they followed him to the door of the cave. He turned to Reemish. I'm going back in there, he said. No. Gale clutched at his arms. Don't, Ron, you'll be George all over again, and I couldn't stand that. He bent down and kissed her, then pushed her gently aside. He looked at Reemish. The policeman hesitated. You owe me this much, said Barnard. You're putting me on a spot, Reemish growled. But go ahead, if you must. As Barnard started to close the door behind him, he was thrown to the floor by Lansford's sudden rush. The hard-faced policeman threw a bolt over the door, then dived on Barnard, clutching for the helmet. The reporter fought back instinctively. His feet went into Lansford as the other dived on him. He rose as far as his knees and delivered short solid punches to the body as Lansford clawed desperately for the silver band. Suddenly Lansford stiffened with an expression of utter horror and fell away. For a minute Barnard watched, building up his own strength. Then he tore the helmet from his head, hurled it far from him. Come on, you devils, he growled. I want my mind back. When Barnard dragged Lansford out of the cave, his eyes were bright, and a happy grin was on his face. The first thing he saw was Gale, utterly miserable against a wall of the corridor. The first thing he did was kiss her amazed face. You're the boss now, he told the equally amazed Reemish. If you'll take a suggestion, let's find Lansford's hoard and throw all the silver coins into that cave. That should put an end to the energy creatures. Reemish looked distastefully at the drooling thing that had been Lansford and holstered his gun. He nodded. And we'll bring the rest of his treasure back to civilization. We can use it to rehabilitate neoin addicts. He looked hopefully at Barnard. When you print this, you won't be too hard on the space police? We could use some favorable publicity, Barnard was whispering to Gale. Both were grinning widely. Barnard turned his grin to Reemish. We love the space police, he assured the officer. Now, as the highest official on this planet, you have the power to marry people. If you'll hurry up, we'll be starting back to Earth on our honeymoon. He was suddenly thoughtful. And maybe to do a column or two for the System News Service. End of Mind Stealers of Pluto, by Joseph Farrell.